Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be sharing with you a shadow work mistake that could absolutely compromise the quality of your life, so you do not want to miss this one. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you a shadow work mistake that I've made in the past that could really compromise the quality of your life and really ruin your life if you're not careful. And when I say this, it might seem like clickbait or it might seem like I'm being hyperbolic, but really it isn't, because this can have huge consequences to your life. So I wanted to make sure that I shared this video in particular. Now, before I get into the shadow work mistake, let me give a quick explanation of what the shadow is and what shadow work is. So what the shadow is kind of like the blind spot of the human psyche, almost like the underneath the rug of the human psyche, where we basically fragment off parts of ourselves and we push it underneath that rug to forget about them. And what shadow work is it's about reconnecting with those repressed parts of ourselves and bringing them back into the fold of the conscious personality. Now, when it comes to the shadow, the reason why we put parts of ourselves in the unconscious is to either preserve an identity, preserve a worldview, to cope with trauma, or to cope with unmet needs. So there's always some kind of very important reason why we're pushing parts of ourselves away into the shadow. And the process of shadow work is about working with those underlying reasons why we push those parts away in the first place and resolving them so that we can safely integrate those aspects of ourselves back into our conscious awareness. And oftentimes, if we push parts of ourselves away into the shadow, and there are these different reasons why we push these parts into the shadow, we will also create different protection mechanisms and coping strategies to sort of cope with life. So if we could say that integrating the shadow is about healing, basically having parts of ourselves pushed into the shadow is about coping. And while what the intention is to heal with shadow work, those coping strategies that we use are often quite important for bringing us forward in life and for helping us make things work out, even if they are not perfect. And certain coping strategies that we use might be carrying a whole lot of weight for us in our life and really keeping things together for us. And so the mistake that I made when I first started to become aware of my shadow was actually to go into resistance and into opposition with the coping strategies that I was using beforehand. And those coping strategies were actually bearing a lot of weight and keeping a lot of things going in my life that I really needed to continue on with. And because of this, I sort of lost meaning and I lost the ability to motivate myself. And I lost a lot of different things that were really creating support. So what that big mistake is essentially trying to get rid of your coping strategies or trying to go into opposition to those coping strategies because you can see that they come from a place that's rooted in the shadow. So to give an analogy to make this a bit clearer, let's say that your psyche and your sense of self and your way of operating in life, let's say that we can symbolize that as a house. And whenever you have to fragment off parts of yourself and put those parts in the shadow and go unconscious to them, what happens is that it's like kind of taking out parts of the foundation of the house, or it's taking out certain support pillars within that house. And so when that happens, that you lose those support pillars within the house that are naturally integrated into the house, you have to find a way to support the house otherwise with your coping strategies. And so you might find ways to kind of scaffold up the roof of the house or scaffold up the walls of the house using these kind of holding patterns of certain behaviors or mindsets to help yourself kind of move forward. And when it's the case that we start doing shadow work, we're essentially looking at those kind of coping strategies and those sort of temporary scaffolds to the sense of self and to the worldview and to, let's say, your relationship with life. And we're looking and we're going oh, I see this temporary scaffolding here, this temporary coping strategy here is actually rooted down in this shadow dynamic. And when it's the case that we become aware of that, we might be tempted to actually go into resistance to the scaffolding that's holding the house up. And so, for example, when I was 20 years old and I had a plant medicine induced awakening experience. Before that, I had been really focused on achievement, and everything in my life was about achievement. My whole entire worldview was like, oh, if I don't achieve things, then I'm not worth anything, right? And so this was causing a lot of problems, but I had to understand, and what I didn't understand at the time is that that was like a temporary scaffolding that was like helping me sort of cope in life because I had parts of myself that were repressed and because I was dealing with like traumas and unmet needs from earlier parts in life. And so when I saw the fact that my achievement, was coming from this like sense of self-hatred and this sense of shame and all of these underlying wounds, instead of knowing how to actually resolve those wounds at the deeper level, what I did is I started to think, oh, trying to achieve things, that's the problem. Like, because I'm trying to achieve things and because I'm like a workaholic, that's the bad thing. And so I basically went into opposition to those coping strategies, and I tried to topple them over, and I made it to where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to achieve anything anymore. I'm not going to build identities out of achievement. And what ended up happening is that I really had this collapse of meaning in my life. And I went into opposition to essentially all of the tools that I had developed over the course of my life to actually cope with the sort of internal situation with regard to my shadow. So within that analogy, it was like I was starting to explore the house of my psyche, and I saw all of these like scaffolds, and instead of actually like sort of fixing the foundational issues that were like creating the need for that scaffolding in the first place, I just tried to tear the scaffolding down. It's a little bit like, let's say if I broke my leg and I was like walking around with crutches, but I was somehow unaware that I was walking around with crutches, and then suddenly I become aware that I'm walking around with crutches, and I go, oh no, I'm walking around with crutches, that's bad, and then I try to throw my crutches away, but I'm not actually healing the leg. And so what ends up happening is that I end up like falling over and maybe creating more injury to myself than I would have otherwise had, and making it to where I can't actually get around because I'm now in opposition to the concept of crutches altogether. So when it comes to your weight-bearing coping strategies, what you want to do is you want to hold on to those for as long as you need them, and to actually resolve the deeper root cause reason why you have those temporary scaffoldings for the house, or why you're having those kind of crutches in the first place. So instead of thinking, oh, that's a bad thing to do, I need to not be doing that, which is the mistake that I made, instead being like, oh, that's interesting, I see that I need to walk with crutches in this situation, or oh, I see I have this scaffolding within the house because I'm missing some of the foundations of that house. Instead of going into opposition to that, get curious. Now, before we get any further into the video, I wanted to mention that tomorrow, Monday, April 25th, is the last day to enroll for the beta phase of my group coaching program, Shadow Work for Self-Sabotage. It's for ambitious people who want to learn how to use shadow work to overcome self-sabotage, procrastination, and other motivation issues. And if you would like to join during the beta phase, where you get a discounted rate in exchange for valuable feedback to help me make the course into its highest and best version, make sure that you schedule a discovery call with me either today or tomorrow. And once April 25th is passed, I won't be accepting anybody else into the program for the next 3 months after that. And so if you're interested in joining during the beta, make sure you schedule your discovery call today. And I'll leave that link down below in the description box. All right, so let's get back into the video. So again, that number one mistake is going into resistance and opposition to your coping strategies that are actually helping you move forward in life and to deal with the challenges of life. And so I wanted to give a hypothetical scenario to illustrate how important it is to not go into opposition to your coping strategies, even if those coping strategies aren't perfect. So let's say that William had a previous career as an author, and within that previous career as an author, he had a lot of negative experiences with the publishing industry. And he came to develop, a really strong aversion to publishers and publishing houses because of the negative experiences that he had. Then let's say about 10 years ago, William decided to transition careers. Instead of being an author himself and seeking to be published, he wants to actually help other authors to navigate the publishing industry in a way that actually helps them get the benefits of their work and to not have the fruits of their labor stolen by, let's say, greedy publishing houses. And because of his negative experiences as an author, William ended up developing this idea in his mind, or really a narrative, that these publishing houses and the people that work in them are like the villains, and he sees himself as the hero that comes in and helps other authors who are the victims. And it's like he sees his job as essentially defeating evildoers, and he thinks about it in a very comic book like way that's very black and white. And he spends a lot of time and energy thinking about and demonizing people who work in these publishing companies, and even starts to kind of see them as less than human and more like just villains in a movie. And because of this narrative, he's very motivated to get the results that his clients, the authors, are looking for, and he really does help them navigate that industry. But then let's say that William runs across one of my videos where I'm talking about the value of dropping judgments and shadow work and seeing the truth of what is, or maybe he starts hanging out with a bunch of spiritualists who are really kumbaya and, are really showing him that there's no bad guys in the absolute kind of sense. And he starts to maybe start questioning into that narrative framework that he's been operating through, where he sees himself as the hero defeating these villains in the publishing industry. And maybe he even sees somebody else doing the same thing and it really puts him off. He sees somebody else, let's say, vilifying and demonizing, let's say, a group of people, and he's like, oh, okay, I can see myself in that, and I don't necessarily like that. And so what he does is he goes into opposition to his tendency to create that sort of heroes and villains narrative, and he starts pushing it away, and he starts judging himself anytime there is even the tendency to kind of see himself in that role, or to start seeing the publishing company as villains. And ultimately, at the deepest level, what's more true is the fact that, people who work in the publishing industry are just people just like everyone else, and all people are capable of positive and negative things. But what he didn't realize is how much weight that this story of the heroes and the villains was really keeping him, let's say, motivated, because it gave him a lot of meaning in his career. And now it's like he feels like he can't quite create that meaning in order to move himself forward with his career. And he isn't getting his clients as much success because he doesn't have that narrative story behind him to create the kind of tension and to create that kind of meaning. And it's here that we see that William has truly kicked away a weight-bearing coping strategy that has worked for him before, and now he's not able to motivate himself the way that he's used to motivating himself. And parts of his quality of life are really taking a dive because of it. What he used to find a lot of meaning in his work, now he's unable to find that meaning. Now, while his paradigm is maybe more reflective of what's true, he hasn't yet replaced that sort of heroes and villains narrative, with another more holistic form of meaning, something else that drives him forward. Instead, he just went into opposition to this coping strategy because he sees the issues with it, and he sees how it's rooted down in deeper dynamics. So he wants to get rid of it, but he tries to sort of cut it off at the surface instead of actually working with the root of it. And because of that opposition to it, and because of trying to cut away that symptom and that self-judgment even at having that sort of manifestation of that narrative, what happens is that he's now sort of almost rowed himself up the river, but now he's kicked away his oars. He's sort of floating around aimlessly in life. And it's a really difficult situation to be in when you go into opposition to your coping strategies, because you basically tie your hands behind your back and you don't allow yourself to do what works, given that there's maybe no other strategy that you've found yet, or maybe you haven't even done fully the integration process, so you haven't actually found ways to sort of support your life without having to use those coping strategies. And it's quite similar with my situation, where before there was this tendency to be a total workaholic and to use achievement to try to earn value and to try to prove myself valuable. And once I saw that those tendencies towards achievement were coming from a deep sense of self-hatred and shame, instead of working on the shame directly, I just went into opposition to the coping mechanism. And I made it to where I didn't allow myself to try to achieve things or to create a positive identity based off of achievement. And what ended up happening is that I ended up like not being able to motivate myself forward in life, but I also didn't give myself the little boosts of confidence that and self-efficacy that those achievements were giving me, that were actually sort of bearing a weight for me. So before, there was this sense of like I could overcome shame temporarily by, sort of feeling good about myself because I achieved this or I did this other thing. When I closed off that outlet for coping, what ended up happening is that need for coping ended up coming out in a worse way. So instead of focusing on my achievements, I got really focused on my appearance and got really self-conscious about my appearance and started sort of micromanaging my appearance to try to get away from shame. And so what was previously benefiting me, it's like the shame and the self-hatred was still there. What was previously actually benefiting me in other ways and that had a lot of side benefits now was getting channeled into this much less effective coping strategy that was actually creating more problems. And on top of that, I also lost meaning and I lost motivation for things that I really do genuinely enjoy doing. So it's really important to keep your weight-bearing coping strategies around until they are actually rendered obsolete and to be able to work through them at the deeper roots. So for example, if I would have worked at the roots of my own shame and self-hatred, I could see that even that was a coping strategy based off of a deeper underlying belief that I'll be abandoned if I make a mistake. And so these are things that in the years since then I've worked into, and that's enabled me to organically let go of more of that shame and self-hatred. Whereas at that point in time, I just noticed that these coping strategies were coming from this negative place without understanding the deeper underlying reason. And so I still needed the function of those coping strategies, but I had just gone into resistance to that function. And it was creating other problems in my life that, were not necessary for me to go through. Now, one caveat that I would mention here is that sometimes our weight-bearing coping strategies are themselves a huge problem. So for example, a lot of times with addiction, so like substance abuse and things like this, those types of things can be weight-bearing coping strategies too. And sometimes it's the case that they're even keeping us from even worse things. So let's say there was one person that I encountered that was using, let's say, a drug addiction actually to stay away from suicidal tendencies. And so it's almost like using the bad to get away from the worse. And when those are the case, I recommend really working with a specialist, somebody who works with addiction, who has a lot of experience with that, because being able to create that shift from one coping strategy to another can be quite difficult. And also healing the underlying reasons so that you no longer need those coping strategies. So when it comes to coping strategies that are quite negative, what you want to do ideally is you want to shift those coping strategies. But when it comes to extremely negative coping strategies, those can be very difficult to shift. And especially because they tend to serve other purposes, it's really important in those cases to work with a professional. And so those are really important things to keep in mind for if your weight-bearing coping strategy is actually creating tons of problems for you in life and is an intensely negative weight-bearing coping strategy. Now, if you find yourself engaging in a weight-bearing coping strategy and you want to work with it to be able to resolve the need for that weight-bearing coping strategy, here are some suggestions that I have. All right, so my first suggestion is to take things really slowly. So if you notice yourself engaging in a weight-bearing coping strategy and you want to be able to resolve the underlying reason why that strategy is necessary in the first place, and you maybe even want to shift that coping strategy so that you no longer have to engage in it, I recommend don't do anything that's like a knee-jerk reaction. So for example, when I first saw that, my tendency toward achievement was was coming from self-hatred, my automatic tendency was like, okay, I can't achieve anything ever again anymore. I can't ever be in that framework, and in that like frame of mind, because I saw that as like the cause of that underlying self-hatred and something that was making it worse. And so with that dynamic, I basically tried to do a 180 with my entire identity and my entire worldview without actually having another worldview to kind of connect into, and without being able to keep the homeostasis of stability of like having a solid set identity and worldview. So you want to make that transition really slow so that you don't overturn the apple cart, because that can put you into a real mess, and that's where you get into life-ruining territory. All right, so my second piece of advice is to try to transmute that weight-bearing coping strategy into its highest expression or into a better form. So for example, when it came to my coping strategy of using achievements to, let's say, sort of overcome like self-hatred, I really needed that coping strategy at the time, and it was really having a lot of net benefits for me. Like there were so many things that I got in life from that negative dynamic, and basically that coping strategy was still benefiting me. And so I would say that it was a fairly high expression of that coping strategy. But if I can find, let's say, a better one even still, then that's even better, that still bears the same weight. Now, to give an example of this, let's say that I have a tendency to disassociate when I feel emotionally dysregulated, and it's creating a lot of negative consequences in my life, despite the fact that it is a weight-bearing coping strategy. And so basically what I want to do is I want to see if I can find some other way to deal with that emotional dysregulation without disassociating that's actually going to serve me better than the disassociation does. So let's say, for example, instead of disassociating, I learn emotional regulation skills in order to cope with those deeper underlying feelings. Now, ideally, I want to actually go in and heal those and work through those and process those. But learning, let's say, how to stimulate the vagus nerve or to use deep breathing exercises to bring myself out of that emotionally dysregulated state, as opposed to going into dysregulation, that is a far healthier coping strategy to use than that disassociation tendency. Another thing you'll want to do is you'll want to find other sources of meaning and motivation. When it's the case that we have our life wrapped up in certain weight-bearing coping strategies, they end up basically weaving themselves right into our identity, right into our worldview, and right into our motivations and our meaning-making process. And so when it's the case that we try to let go of these coping strategies, oftentimes it's associated with a loss of meaning and a loss of motivation that are deeply intertwined with one another, as we tend to motivate ourselves based off of where our meaning is. And so what ended up happening to me whenever I had this realization that all of my tendencies toward achievement were coming from this self-hatred, well, it just totally flipped around my narrative around myself as this high-achieving person. And there was so much meaning in that I just lost all of a sudden. And then I didn't have anything else to like sort of hang my hat on. I didn't have any kind of motivation, because I was like, oh, well, if I motivate myself, that's bad. If I achieve things, that's bad. And so I didn't have any way to actually cultivate positive meaning. And so what you want to do is, if you're trying to shift one of these weight-bearing coping strategies, is you want to build yourself other sources of meaning and other sources of motivation, so that if that scaffolding gets taken out, it doesn't collapse the whole entire house. All right, now the next thing I would recommend is to identify what this coping strategy's function is. What is it actually helping you cope with? And so once you know that, you can move on to the next step, which was actually going in and resolving the underlying reason for that coping strategy. For example, my whole thing about I have to achieve was based off of that deeper self-hatred. And so I could see that that achievement is a way to temporarily get away from that deeper sense of self-hatred. But to go deeper into that sense of self-hatred is there so that I can police myself, because I have a belief that if I make mistakes, mistakes, then I will be ostracized or I will be kind of kicked out of the tribe. And so there's really a connection issue at the deepest level that's presenting itself as shame and self-hatred, which is then further, let's say, presenting itself in these ways of overcoming and compensating for that shame and self-hatred through achievement and through trying to use achievement to prove myself superior and not inferior. So what it looks like at the very top level is not what it is at the roots. And once you see that what that weight-bearing coping strategies function is, you can then start to kind of see that as almost like a ladder that can take you down to those deeper underlying reasons why you're using that coping strategy in the first place. And when you do that, you can resolve things at the deeper level without having to fight with the symptoms. Now, that's all I have for you for now. If you like this video, go ahead, click the like button down below and give me a comment. Also, if you are interested in my Shadow Work for Self-Sabotage group coaching program and you would like to join during the beta, go ahead and schedule your free discovery call now, because by tomorrow, like tomorrow evening is the last time you can actually join during the beta. So make sure that you get on that really quick if you're interested. And if you would like to learn more about shadow work, go ahead, click this link right here. And until next time, keep becoming more you.